Hello, and welcome to another edition of U.S. Japan Council's Japanese Americans and Japan Legacies video series. I'm Deborah Nakatomi. Diane Fukami and I are your hosts for this series of dialogues highlighting the lives and journeys of prominent Japanese American leaders, each of them pioneers in developing the U.S. Japan relationship. Through their stories, we will learn the role of Japanese Americans in strengthening US Japan relations and in ways in which their experiences with Japan have contributed to their Japanese American identity and our community. We'd like to thank US Japan Council for providing this opportunity to share their unique and powerful stories. We would also like to thank our friends at Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their invaluable support of this program and of Japanese American leaders to nurture the US-Japan relationship. Today, we welcome Dennis Teranishi, CEO of PICTER and former board chair of USJC, and he reminds us that he is also the proud grandfather of 4. So welcome, Dennis. We're excited to have you with us
Good
today.
morning.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning. We're very excited to get started and to have you share your very unique story. Your Japanese American upbringing was there in Hawaii, and you were raised in a small town, and we're really anxious to hear some of those early memories of that upbringing in Hawaii.
So, I had listened earlier to Phyllis's background story, and in Hawaii, we're so different in that I was raised in primarily a Japanese American community where a large number of people were of Japanese American ancestry. So we maintained, and the Japanese temples were a significant part of our life. So we had a very, we didn't face the kind of discrimination that some of the mainland Japanese Americans faced. We all went to Japanese language school. We all knew we were going to be in the military. So the local community had us take either judo or aikido or kendo. We went to Boy Scouts to prepare, and all those kinds of things. And we had a very strong Japanese American baseball league. So all the churches sponsored a baseball team. So we were able to continue to meet other Japanese Americans from other communities via this process. So, and most of my Japanese neighbors, and I can still remember most of the names of the families were farmers, just like my grandfather and my father. So they were all Japanese farmers surrounding us, and there were about 30 of them. So there were, one or two Filipino families and one or two Caucasian families and Hawaiian families, but majority were Japanese Americans.
I remembered you had some really vivid memories of your grandparents, your grandfather and your grandmother, because they were so much a part of those early family years growing up in Hawaii. Share
Yes,
some of those stories about them.
sure. So my grandfather came from, of course, Japan to work on the sugar plantation, and so and my grandmother also came from Yamaguchi-ken. Both of them came from Yamaguchi-ken, and they were working for a sugar plantation on the north shore of Oahu called Kahuku Sugar. And my grandfather was one of the activists who was always fighting for better work conditions. And one time, I think they got too boisterous, so he was asked to leave the plantation. So my grandmother tells us this story about having a 3-year-old and being pregnant with my father and being kicked out of housing and no place to go. So they had gone to the mountains to dig irrigation tunnels. There was a Japanese contractor who was hiring people to dig irrigation tunnels to bring water from the wet windward side to the dry leeward side. So they did that for a few years, earned enough money, and then came back down to the North Shore and leased some land to start farming. So when by the time my parents got married and I was born, my grandparents lived with my parents. So I was raised with my grandparents. So my grandmother only spoke, well, most of the time, 90% of the time, she spoke Japanese. So I was raised by my grandparents in our house. So I had a significant Japanese upbringing through them. So I went to Japanese language school because my grandmother forced me to or encouraged me to. And then later on in high school days, when I was old enough to had to work on the farm, that was one way of not having to work on the farm was to go to Japanese language school, which was always after our regular school. So I never came home until about 5:30. So by that time, it was too late to work on the farm. So that was one way of avoiding farm work.
Dennis, your inclination to nurture started actually at a really young age. I mean, not just your love of all things agriculture, but also we have pictures of you, I think, with 4-H and raising livestock, at least initially. Tell us a little bit about that.
So yeah, so that's an unforgettable moment because you get a steer that's about 6 months old and you raise it for about 2 years, and it becomes a pet. It's so tame. It's more tame than a dog. I used to walk him next to me every day to train him for the auction that we eventually had to take him to. And so it was a wonderful experience until the day I had to part with him. It was so difficult that I never wanted to do another steer project because you become so close to the animal that it was so hard. I used to give him a bath every weekend. I would cut his nails, hoofs, and shine it, and all the fun things. But it was so hard, and it was something. It took me a long time to get over. So I changed the
So,
chicken projects after that.
well, we can see where immersing yourself in plant study would be a little less hurtful for you.
Yeah.
And so you decided to go to the mainland and go to school and study agriculture. So let's transition into that and tell us a little bit about going to the mainland and going to college for the first time and what that was like, and also your decision to enroll in ROTC.
Yeah, Hawaii is a small place, and it was the first time I got on an airplane to leave Hawaii. It was a big deal. And in those days, Pan American was the airline that we flew on, and I went to buy my first suit. We all wore suits on the airplane in those days when we flew to the mainland. I got off the plane in San Francisco, asked a lady, how do I get to San Luis Obispo? Remember now, we had no internet. Even maps were hard to get. So I asked the lady how to get there. And so she told me to catch the bus to South San Francisco to the Greyhound terminal, got a Greyhound bus, and I went to school in Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, which is a Aggie school, engineering school. And I love the philosophy. I went there because the philosophy was learn by doing. So it's a very different way of teaching where they make you do a lot of things. So there's a lot of lab courses. So even, for example, I took agricultural mechanics, and one of the things we had to do was to learn how diesel engines run. And so to teach us that, we had to break down and overhaul a tractor. So you learn how to do it so much better because you take everything apart and you put it back together. And my father was a mechanic, so I loved mechanical things, doing those kinds of things. If you're a farmer, you have to learn to do a little bit of everything because everything breaks on the farm. So you have to know a little welding, a little plumbing, a little carpentry, a little electricity, fixing things. So anyway, I went there to Cal Poly, but the big thing that I remember to this day was I caught the bus from the airport to South San Francisco and caught the Greyhound, and the Greyhound started going south again, and we passed the airport. So I was so worried that I might have gone on the wrong bus because I was passing the airport. But anyway, I went to Cal Poly. It was a great school. There were other Hawaii people there, and I enrolled in ROTC because we all knew we had to go in the military. and I found that I really enjoyed ROTC. So actually, although I majored in agriculture, I really majored also in ROTC. I really enjoyed the rigor. I love history, and the military teaches you a lot about history also. So I became a leader. I was one of the battalion commanders, so I had an office in the ROTC unit. So I spent most of my time there when I wasn't in the ag school. And because there were three of us in college, my siblings, I had to work. And so I worked, I had three jobs on campus. So I was always working and doing, schooling and working. I also love to fix cars and race cars. So I worked at a service station at night, so I could, and I would start at 8 o'clock because nobody would come after 8, and I would be able to fix my car and get ready for drag racing on Saturdays. But anyway, that was my uh, college years. It was a great time in my life.
We have this wonderful picture of you and Brenda, and you're looking so handsome in your uniform.
Yeah, so that was I was the battalion commander. This was the ROTC ball. So yeah, that was a long time ago.
And then, did you know
1960.
at what point? At what point did you meet Brenda then?
So Brenda and I met when we were in preschool. So we're 3 years old when we first met. Yeah.
And she
So you,
followed you to California, or how
No.
did you guys
Yeah.
become a grown-up couple?
So we started dating when we were in high school, and then I went to school in California. She went to school at the University of Hawaii. Then she graduated. Brenda is much smarter than me, so she finished in 3 years, and went to. She was at UCLA getting her master's. So that was why she was in California and during my senior year. And so she came up to San Luis Obispo from LA to attend our ROTC ball.
Well, Brenda's pretty smart. She got you as a husband, so no argument from us there. You had mentioned in an earlier conversation that the Army and what you learned there provided real life lessons for you in terms of managing things, in terms of leadership. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So, I enjoyed ROTC, and even at that time, I, I graduated as I love ROTC so much. So my goal was to become the distinguished military graduate. So I was, so I went at graduation, I was able to do that, but it was a difficult time. I never had felt discrimination very much in Hawaii, but when I went to school in California, I could feel it. There was some of it. Um, so it made you study harder and want to do better. And thank goodness for me, because there were so many other ROTC cadets who were from Hawaii. So I would always be able to ask them to help volunteer to do various things. So as a consequence, I was able to become a battalion commander, and but I couldn't become the commander of the unit. And but by the time I graduated, I was able to graduate as a top military graduate. So it was okay at the end, but it was a very difficult time for me from that standpoint. But I really enjoyed the military, so I wanted to make military a career until Brenda told me, you're so stupid. Don't you know there's a war in Vietnam? And so I had signed up to go infantry, Ranger, Airborne, and then she made me apply to graduate school instead. So the Army gave me a 2-year deferment. I came back to the University of Hawaii, and I studied. I got a master's degree in cell chemistry and plant nutrition, which then after I graduated, I was assigned to U.S. Army Research Center, which was a surprise to me. But anyway, I was assigned to Dartmouth, where the Army was doing research on finding a method to detect tunnels in Vietnam. And that's when I first learned the power of the United States. They were able to put together a team of us. There was a civil engineer, infrared physicist, uh, geographer, geologist, forester, and myself. And we were put on a team, and we were given the assignment to come up with a way to use air photos to detect tunnels in Vietnam. And they gave us whatever resources we needed to do this. And the chief scientist was an air photo specialist from Purdue University. So, uh, one day I'll tell you the details of this story, but within 1 year, we were able to find the major tunnels in Vietnam using air photos. And I'll quickly give you a story about this. The geologists and geographers went first, and they told us look for rivers that meander, because to have caves, you have to have it's limestone, so calcareous soils are softer than, I mean, calcareous rock is softer than granite, for example. So if the rivers were angular, we knew that was not the place. So the forester and I went and took photos of all the plants and trees that we knew grew in alkaline soil, because limestone is alkaline. So through that type of deductive reasoning and process, we were able to come up with the process to find where most of the tunnels were. So anyway, so that's how we were able to do that. And I had a second assignment my second year, and that was to find the Navy wanted to charge the Earth's mantle to make it into an antenna, so that Polaris submarines would not have to surface to get radio signals. So, being a soil chemist, my job was to find the region in the United States that had the best soils that would conduct electricity. And that region happens to be in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. So my job with a team of four others was with two snowmobiles was to map the soils and then test to make sure whatever the USDA maps of the soils of the region were correct. So I used to go out in snowmobiles in the middle of winter at minus 20 degrees in that region, taking soil samples. Um, Never knew what coal was until I spent weeks out in the Wisconsin, Michigan area with snowmobiles. Of course, it was fun too. But anyway, that was that. And the other major thing that happened to me in the military was that I went to basic training in Fort Lee, Virginia, a basic officer training, and that's when I first had my first discrimination, where since Brenda and I were married, I couldn't stay in the BOQ, the Bachelor Officers Quarters, so I had to find an apartment. So I got the classified ads of the newspaper, and called. I went to 6 different places. Every place said that they had a place open. I said, "Hello, this is Lieutenant Teranishi. I see you have a studio or 1 bedroom. May I come and see it?" And they said, "Oh, of course, sir." As soon as we got out of the car and they saw we were Asians, we were not able to find a place to rent. And finally, we drove by a trailer court, and we were able to rent an old trailer. And this was in the summer, July, August, in the summer, where temperatures were 100 degrees and close to 100 degrees in Richmond, Virginia, and there's no air conditioning in those places. But anyway, that was where I first got my first glimpse of what discrimination felt like.
I think it was also while you were in the Army that you took your first trip to Japan, also, right?
Yes.
So
So
tell us about that first impression that you had going as a young man to Japan.
So yeah, it happened after I got out of the active army, but I was in the reserve for 10 years, and one of our assignments was to go to different parts of the Far East to train with the regular army. So once we had gone to Thailand, another time to Korea, and once to Japan. And when I went to Japan for the first time, I was so impressed impressed with how friendly and polite the people were and how clean everything was. There's no litter in Japan. Everything was so clean. So and so it made me want to go back to Japan. So as I started my business career, I always looked for, tried to find a way to do business with Japan somehow. And so that's what motivated me to become uh, more oriented toward Japan. Oh, yeah, and I wanted to tell another story about the military and discrimination. And one of the more significant things that affected me was that um, there were no military units above us in New Hampshire. So periodically, we would have assignments as officers to notify families that their sons or husbands were killed, and we had to go notify them. And I was only 23 years old, and nobody trains you; they just give you a field manual. And I had my first assignment was to notify a parent that their 19-year-old who was supposed to come home for Thanksgiving the week before was killed in Vietnam. So I had to drive up and drive up. It was on the edge of Maine and Canada. So I drove up there and I was sitting in the car after I got to the house for a few minutes, trying to compose myself, repeating what I was going to say. And it was cold, there was snow on the ground, but my underarms were wet with perspiration from nervousness because I was recalling how I was discriminated just a few months ago in August, and this was November, in Virginia, about not being able to get an apartment. And thinking, what is this woman going to say when she sees an Asian person in a US Army uniform informing her that her 19-year-old was killed in Vietnam by an Asian? Anyway, so I vividly remember the walk up the sidewalk to the house, knocking on the door, and the mother, rushing out to the front, wiping her hands on the apron. And as soon as she saw me, she raised her hand and said, "No." And, that was the hardest assignment I've ever had in my life to this day. So sometimes when I have hard days at work, I try to remember this, and everything sets a different, you get a different perspective in life. But anyway, thank you for asking me that question.
It sounds like that experience has stayed with you. Thank you for sharing that. So let's talk a little bit about that early career as you were transitioning, getting discharged out of the Army, and you started with your first job. No surprise, working in ag. No surprise at all. So tell us about some of the early career experiences that you had, and as you were forging your path.
So I went to work for the largest corporation in Hawaii. It was a $2.4 billion company. One of their largest holdings they had 5 sugar plantations on 4 different islands. And I was hired as the agronomist. So our job was to, everything was handled at centralized at headquarters. So my job was to coordinate all of the research on the sugar plantations with the Sugar Association's research station. So breeding work and fertility trials and things like that. So, but the sugar industry was beginning to shrink. So because the economics weren't working, so companies were beginning to combine. So small plantations combined with bigger ones. And so during my 19 years at that company, the first 10 was in the sugar side. And but then I could see that it was changing. So I asked my superiors if I could move more into the business side, because I thought that the sugar wasn't going to survive, so we need to find some other crops. So I moved into developing new crops, and we started plant nurseries because in the 1980s, nursery plants were big, the boom. So we built a nursery in Hawaii, and um, then I started going, joining an M&A team, mergers and acquisition. So it was a new beginning of a new career for me after about 10 years. So I was on a mergers and acquisition team. So I was constantly flying all over the US. And within 5 years, we became the biggest nursery company in the US. And uh, I learned that business was easier than science. So I moved and I enjoyed managing and working with people. So I moved more into business management from a technical scientific background, and I've loved it ever since. So I love managing and leading people. So the change to the business side was a big positive change for me. And also in that time also, I started growing and exporting papayas for this company. So we were the largest papaya grower in Hawaii. So I teamed up with Mitsubishi, and Mitsubishi was our partner. So I used to get to go to Japan two times a year to visit our customers, and that um, example or experience made me want to do even more with Japan.
So Dennis, you are synonymous with Hawaiian Host. When I first met you, you were Mr. Hawaiian Host. You continue to be Mr. Hawaiian Host for many of us. So tell us about how you got associated with Hawaiian Host and some of the highlights of the work that you did there. And tell us about what we're looking at here. This is kind of a cute box top with your face on it.
Yeah, so when I retired after 14 years with Hawaiian Host, the employees got together and designed a box and got our box maker to make a box. Few of these, so everybody had it. We had a party and everybody had a gift. But anyway, you can't see what's written, but the words in there are so funny. Always when I see that, it always reminds me of my good times there. But how I started working for Hawaiian Host is all again by chance. I just happened to sit next to the owner of Hawaiian Host on a JAL flight to Tokyo. And by the time we landed in Tokyo, it's about an 9-hour flight. He had offered me a job to go work for Hawaiian Host. And this was 1982. I had just moved back to Hawaii. I was living in San Francisco because I was on the mergers and acquisition team, and we're flying so much that I moved. Our family had moved to San Francisco, and I did not enjoy living in. I enjoyed living in San Francisco, but my children missed their grandparents so much that they kept on bugging us about moving back to Hawaii, or they told us, "Oh, you can stay here, but we want to go live with Grandpa and Grandma." So we decided to move back to Hawaii, and so Mr. Takitani, who was the owner of Hawaiian Host, wanted me to move to Gardena to start their new factory in Gardena. So I said to him, "No, thank you, but I just moved back to Hawaii, so I don't want to move back to LA." And so, but he worked on me for 9 years. Every month we would have lunch. And however, unfortunately, in 1989, he had pancreatic cancer and he died within 6 months. So his company was not ready for him to pass away. So 2 years after he passed away, the then replacement president asked me to join Hawaiian Host. And so that's how I went to Hawaiian Host. But I stayed there only for 3 years because the president and I couldn't get along, and he was the new president and I. So I quit, and I left. I had a contract. My contract ended. So I always wanted to be a consultant, but I always had golden handcuff or was too scared to quit. So I thought, oh, this is a good time to try. So I started my consulting company, and I did that for 5 years until Colbert Matsumoto, another USJC member, called me up one day and said he was on the board of Hawaiian Host. So he asked me if I would come back to Hawaiian Host. And so that was in 1997. So I signed a 5-year contract and I stayed for 14 years. And Hawaiian Host has 15 people in Tokyo. We have a big warehouse and an office. So with Hawaiian Host, I was able to go to Japan even more often, and loved it even more. And we have Hawaiian Host at that time sold it to 23 countries in the Asia Pacific area. So it was so wonderful to be able to go to Singapore and Vietnam and Indonesia and Philippines, wherever that we did business. So the job allowed me to meet and do business in so many different countries and meet so many different nice people, especially in Japan.
One of the things you told us was that what you liked, or one of the aspects that you liked over at Hawaiian Host, was your chance to demonstrate to the employees how to become better citizens, how to give more and contribute more in a global way. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, you guys ask really hard questions, right? So, so one of the things I'm most proud of at Hawaiian Host was that, in society, in the olden days when we were growing up, for example, the community was everything. We went to school there, we worked there, we played baseball, or we went to Boy Scouts, all within the same community. We all went to church. Now we live in one community, we go to school in a different community, we work in a different community. So the sense of that community, as small as Hawaii is not the same. So if you don't go to church or have those kinds of social institutions to teach you, people forget about the value of community and the value of citizenship. And what does it mean to be a responsible citizen of your community, of your state, and of your country, and of the world also. So in Hawaii, we have the United Way, and we have a very, very strong United Way system, and we call it Aloha United Way. So most companies participate in the Aloha United Way thing. And so my goal was to teach employees how to become better citizens. So after about 2 or 3 years, I was so happy because I was able to get 100% of our employees to contribute to the Aloha United Way. And so I worked really hard on that. I bring speakers in from American Heart Association, American Cancer Society, for example. And I would tell people, not the Catholic charities or some of the other things where drugs, people who treated drugs or family trauma, although that's real too. But when you're earning, $10 an hour, donating is very difficult. And when you think, why do I have to give to MAD, or some other families, when my family, I have to work, so hard and to support my family. So cancer and heart problems, I said, was something that was universal. Somebody in your family is going to have cancer or heart problems. So it was an easier thing to start with. So anyway, we had cooked baking and all kinds of stuff to get people interested and excited. So after we were able to get 100% of the employees to participate, and I purposely did not want to see the list because I don't want to create undue pressure on anybody. But after we did that, everybody was so proud of it that throughout the last few remaining years of my term at Hawaiian Host, they continued to maintain 100%. So that was what I was most proud of accomplishing at Hawaiian Host.
Your history with being philanthropic and being very generous, contributed to your University of Hawaii honoring you with Alumnus of the Year back in the 1990s. We have a photo that we want to show that shows you and your family during younger times. but also what this points to is this sort of spirit that you just talked to us about giving, about constantly, contributing to society in some way. this now leads into your most current venture, which is nonprofit. You're over at PICTER, you're the CEO and president. Tell us a little bit about what took you from a for-profit company and a very successful career, now going full-time nonprofit.
So yeah, for those of you who've worked with nonprofits will know that, running a nonprofit is more difficult than running a for-profit because you make no profit. So it's it's a unique and very difficult thing to do. But when I was a consultant, how I started is when I was a consultant, Governor Ariyoshi at that time and the president of the university, Fujio Matsuda, were prominent board members of this nonprofit, and they were having financial difficulties. So some of the board members wanted to close it down, and people like Governor Ariyoshi and Fujio Matsuda, the president of the university, did not. So they hired me as a consultant to see if the company could be saved. So I did my analysis and I told them, yes, you could, but you had to do certain things. So they asked me if I would do it. And I said, no, I'm sorry. I have other clients that I had to do work for, so I couldn't do that. So in the interim, they had fired the president, the prior president. So in the interim, Dr. Fujio Matsuda, who was one of my mentors, took over as the interim president. Then 2 weeks after I gave him the report, he had to have emergency open heart surgery. So he calls me up and he tells me, can you come to meet? So he sets me up. I go to his house and his wife puts me in the patio and he gingerly comes out walking with a cane to meet with me after his open heart surgery. So he asked me for a personal favor to become the interim president. So how can you say no? So that's how I got involved. It was 1995 or so, and 18 months later, I had $1 million in the bank. So I said, I quit, go find a president, but he put me on the board. So I've been on the board since 1997, and I've been interim president many times. Interim means you don't get paid. So after I retired, and I continued, I'm not interim anymore. They pay me now. So I've been doing this for the last, 10 years. Even when I was at Hawaiian Host, I was a president of PICTER. Now I spend most of my time at PICTER, other than being on boards and then being an advisor to some other companies. And the purpose of, can I talk a bit about the purpose of PICTER? So the purpose, PICTER was started in 1983 by the former senator from Hawaii, Spark Matsunaga. So Dan Inoue and Spark Matsunaga served in the Congress at the same time. And Spark Matsunaga, unfortunately, died at a young age from cancer. But his idea was to start PICTER to use Hawaii as a bridge between Japan and Hawaii, US. So he was able to get President Reagan and President Nakasone to sign an agreement and created PICTER to be that way to connect both of us. So Gai Musho, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, sent PICTER $1 million a year for 10 years to work on projects that we could do with the United States. So the first major project we worked on was OTEC, Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion, where we developed electricity by pressurizing a solution. In this case, we use ammonia, and we pumped cold water to cool the system down. But anyway, this was a French scientist who developed this concept, and we built a 1 megawatt test plant in Kona on the Big Island of Hawaii. And the pump the water from 1 mile down in the ocean, cold water, it still operates. And we, as a consequence of this project, we created what we call the Hawaii Natural Energy Park, where there are lots of marine businesses, aquacultural businesses in Hawaii. And it was started through the state of Hawaii, the University of Hawaii, PICTER, and MOFA. And one of the biggest export companies, interestingly enough, in Hawaii was a Japanese water company who took this water, desalinated it, and shipped it to Japan as pure, clean ocean water that was desalinated and became so successful. So anyway, we continue now to, right now we're working on a project to, the US Department of Defense approached PICTER to help get Japanese technology company to work on microelectronics because the Defense Department is experiencing um, too many Trojan horses coming in the microelectronics coming in from the Asian market. So they would like to get Japanese companies to work with them. So PICTER is now starting to get involved in this. And the reason why we are able to do this is because we've always had high-level Japanese board members. So the current one is a retired vice minister of MITI, the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. So he, through his help, we are able to work with MITI and NATO to create these types of connections. So it's very interesting, fun work to do. And it really helps US-Japan relations.
Oh, Deborah, you're muted.
I'd
Deborah,
like to build on that, Dennis, because one of my thoughts and reflections about you is what a strong relationship person you are. You're always cultivating relationships with young people. You are so generous with your time as an advisor with business. In fact, I've called upon you a few times myself. And I see this kind of through line in your career and also your work, where you're mentoring. You have this high intention of imparting your knowledge to others. And I want you to talk about what is that philosophy that drives that sense of mentorship, and as well as the discipline that you have in working with young people and taking time to do that, to be an advisor to others.
So the basic thing I think is the reason is because, you know, we had so many Nisei mentors around us and helped us. And I had mentioned, you know, Governor Ariyoshi and Dr. Fujio Matsuda, who's the retired president of the university, and they were board members. They are still board members. They're retired already, but they still come to the board meetings. Dr. Matsuda passed away, unfortunately, in August at age 93 and 94. But he used to come to our board meetings, you know, so these Niseis they either created footsteps for us to follow, or they help build stairs for us to climb. So Fudge Matsuda used to always poke me, you know, what are you sanseis doing? What are you sanseis doing? You know, you got to do something to make this US-Japan relations better, make it better for Japanese Americans. And so US-Japan Council, you know, happens to be, to me, a very good institution where sanseis and yonseis can, and even the next goseis maybe, hopefully. So I am so happy, for example, that my two daughters are so active in US-Japan Council. And I'm wondering why. Maybe it's because of my age, and my daughters are old enough, so and the careers are advanced enough so they can join US-Japan Council and spend time, and yet raise their families. And you know, women have to be super women in order to succeed in the world. But I would like to see more yonseis who are children of our US-Japan Council members become members of US-Japan Council. Like I said earlier, I think, and you know, Dennis Sugino's daughter is, you know, part of this, and I would like to hopefully more members like me will encourage their children to come and join this. And I was the beneficiary of so much mentoring from people like I said, Dr. Matsuda or Governor Ariyoshi and others like them. and my Boy Scout, Cub Scout leaders, my Aikido instructors, different things that they taught us that was so significant. And like in my community, for example, there are four of us who are almost the same age that got the Emperor's Award, the Kunsho Award. I mean, that's to me so remarkable when a small community like ours has so many people who are dedicated to improving U.S.-Japan relations. So
Well,
that's
we
the
have a
kind of thing.
picture of the order when you're receiving the Order of the Rising Sun, and we'd like to also show that one. But I think, Dennis, you lead by example, and you've opened up a lot of doors in terms of generating interest with younger people in the U.S.-Japan relationship. So we're looking at your picture, I guess, when you were receiving the order, as well as your family is there with you to celebrate that.
Yeah, so as a consequence, of that, you have, and I think the other thing is that as we get older, um, we want to share as much of this knowledge that we've accumulated. And the reason why we want to do this also is because you don't want the young people to make the same mistakes that we made. But watching my girls, I think they make the same mistakes anyway. So much of life, I guess, you have to learn the hard way. But I am so happy because in my case, my daughters call me all the time, and my youngest daughter especially, Anne, used to always make me so happy because every time before she hung up the phone, she would tell me, "I love you, Dad." So, what better thing can you have? So I always tell young families, when you get to be my age, when you look back in life, one of the things you want to be able to say that you are successful at, probably the most important thing you want to be able to say you're successful at if you decide to get married and have children, is to be able to say, I raised healthy, happy, and successful children. Because
Well, you can
if
certainly say that because we know your daughters, and not only they're happy and successful, but just wonderful, kind people. So, Dennis, I'd say that you and Brenda did a great job with that.
yeah, Brenda is probably the one who should take most of the credit because for it. But we used to always fight about one thing, and that was Brenda was so strict because she's a educator and she's a school counselor. So she was very strict, and she would always tell me, the problem with you is you always want to be their friend. So yeah, raising children is not an easy job, but it's very fulfilling if they come out right. Because if they're not, if they become drug addicts, or if they have to rely on you, or they become criminals, you as a parent are responsible for it. So being a parent is a very, very difficult, tough responsibility that we don't realize when we're young. But it's an important thing to think about.
Well, going back to being young, I want to circle back to something that you had said earlier because you knew from a young age that you wanted to have a career and a pathways that you could go to Japan, you could help with US-Japan relations, and you've shown that both in your work, but also in your leadership in the US-Japan Council. Can you talk a little bit about what you're most proud of with your time as president of or chair of the board of USJC, and also your thoughts about Irene Hirano Inoue?
So let me talk about Irene first.
Okay.
So, working with Irene was a wonderful experience. She was a remarkable leader. She had the most stamina that I've seen in a chief executive. We would be in Japan, looking for, visiting all our clients and visiting all our sponsors, asking for donations and asking for help with Tomodachi and different programs. We would start at 8 o'clock in the morning with breakfast meetings with, either board members or companies or whatever. and we worked all the way through dinner meetings. And then after dinner, she would have groups that we would meet with. And by Wednesday night, I would tell Irene, I'll be at breakfast through dinner, but I am not going to go drinking after that because I can hardly stay up and I'm so tired and I got to answer all my emails. And so I don't know how she did it, but she kept on doing it every night and, every morning through every night. And, when as you, for those of you who've interacted with Irene, she'll send you emails any time of the day and night. And she's always working. So she had tremendous stamina and she had one level. I mean, she had a very, very even personality. She was always pleasant and polite. So she was a remarkable woman, and she was a terrific leader for us. And we lost a very important person. And by the way, when I first joined, I couldn't believe it because she wasn't full time. She was taking we were only paying 75% of her salary. And so I said, why is this? And she said, because I serve on the Ford Foundation and the Kresge Foundation, so I don't want the organized. I don't want to be full time paid. I said, well, many of us serve on other boards too, so I don't see why that this should be. But she wouldn't give up. So finally, before I left, I retired after 3 years. I was able to convince her. I gradually worked her up to the point where she was fully paid. And the other thing that was very interesting, and most people don't know, is that the Kresge and Ford Foundation are very generous. So if Irene donates $10,000 to the U.S. Japan Council, they'll match it 6-1. So they'll give 60,000 for her 10,000. So we got so much money from these. Or she donated a lot of money through this also. So she not only was she a terrific person to work with, but she knew how to raise money, and she provided a lot of funding for U.S. Japan Council. And I worked with her on good stuff, and I worked on very difficult problem areas. And she was such a gracious person, no matter how difficult it was. So anyway, so let me quickly then go to what I feel was the best thing I was able to do at U.S. Japan Council. Thanks to Jan Yonahiro's constant badgering and reminder, what I'm proud of is that we were able to build the board of directors with more females. So by the time I retired, 50% of our board members were female and 50% were male. And I was so happy that we were able to convince Phyllis Campbell to become the chairman to replace me. So these two women were wonderful to work with. I so much enjoyed my time, especially after I wasn't the chair anymore, working with these two. Of course, they told me what to do all the time, but it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Well, that's a great picture. Your book ended by two very strong, amazing women. Yes. It's a great photograph. So I want to dig a little bit deeper on your time with USJC because as Diane was saying, so much of what you've contributed is kind of this convergence of your experience as a CEO, your experience working in Japan, and also you have this very astute sense of nonprofits, governance, and management. So USJC was also reaching a time of maturity as an organization, and your leadership was really important in terms of stability, sustainability. So talk a bit about that, because USJC has a very strong foundation.
Yeah, so one of the things that I told Irene that I wanted to help with was to, put in some business systems into the organization. So, we try to improve the financial systems, and I because I managed a nonprofit, I always wanted to build that fund balance reserve. And so it was something that we would, whenever we met every quarter, we would highlight what is the fund balance. And we had a goal to reach a certain level by the time I retired. So that was one. The second one was, having strategy sessions. And Suzanne will remember that every quarter I would ask that we would review the strategic process and where were we. Otherwise, if we don't review it every quarter, the day-to-day issues would always take precedence. So Suzanne would always give us an update. We were where we were on the strategic issues. So that was another one. Knowing what to do in a company and being able to do it are two separate things. And that's where, many companies have difficulty. Execution is so difficult because you have to rely on people. And nonprofits are even more difficult because you have such a broad group of audiences that you have to take care of. So anyway, strategic planning and implementation, execution are so important. So those are some of the things I think we were able to do, and I think we were able to raise the prominence of U.S. Japan Council by having our first conference in Tokyo, which was we had over 800 participants at that conference, and we had a second one, two already in Tokyo, and that made a big difference, I think, in helping to elevate the organization. I remember how hard and how scary it was to get the first one going, but everybody worked so hard that we forget about all the details and how much worrying we did in planning the first one. But it was such a success that we forgot already.
Well, you've been really committed to both filling the leadership pipeline. You've recruited both of your daughters to USJC, so you definitely practice what you preach, which is wonderful. And we both know your daughters, and we've had an opportunity to work with them both. But also, you've kept an eye on sustainability of ensuring that USJC continues to have really strong leaders, women leaders, which is really important. So we want to thank you for all of that foundational work, which is so important for organizations to continue to be strong. So Dennis, our time with you is just about up, and we really want to thank you for all your great stories. You are a great storyteller, sharing both your experience, but all of your years supporting USJC. So thank you very much for all you've brought to USJC. We want to also thank the audience for tuning in today. Thank you very much for spending time with us. Your support of USJC and programs like this have enabled USJC to continue to thrive and bring high quality programming. And we hope you enjoyed today's dialogue with Dennis Teranishi. And we hope you'll also check our other series available on USJC's website and our YouTube channel. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Aloha.
Aloha.